Karanga mai, mihi mai, aku rangatira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning. It still is morning. Thank you for all of those who braved the travel difficulties getting here. I live in Tamaki Makaurau, work in a number of places around the country as Christine said, child and adolescent and general psychiatrist. The topic of this conference, I've broadened a little. It's not just about babies, children, and alcohol. It's also about rangitahi, our youth, because tamariki grow up. And if they're affected by fetal alcohol, it doesn't just go away. I'd like to make some acknowledgements. Obviously, Valerie McGinn is a neuropsychologist that I work closely with, and without Valerie, a presentation like this would be hard to do. She wouldn't let me live it down. I'd like to acknowledge the judiciary, because I also work in the forensic psychiatry area, and Principal Judge Andrew Beecroft has been a very powerful force, as has Leah Andrews from the University of Auckland. Now, as Christine mentioned, I've known her for, over the last 5 years or so. Before then, I didn't really know that much about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I'd done all this training in medicine and psychiatry and child and adolescent psychiatry, but still did not know that much. And I find that quite interesting, and I'm kind of humbled when I talk to colleagues who are embarrassed when they don't know about it. So quite well assigned here, Anne Streisguth, Richard Paul Connor, that's the kind of North American group, mostly in Seattle and Vancouver, that have trained and assisted us. And of course there's Christine Rogan and Rebecca Williams. And then the New Zealand contingent, Raymond, Tina Page, Chris Fernando, Peter Levin and Sheila Coldry and others. Now, before I progress, I'd like to acknowledge that fetal alcohol is a controversial area. It's also a sensitive topic. So specifically, I would like to draw attention to that, especially those of us in the audience that have been affected by it. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a lifelong disability. You've heard from our colleague, Elizabeth, from just across the ditch. Some of us refer to it as the West Island of New Zealand, like we in the North Island at the moment. You've heard that FASD is like a head injury, just like a tiny baby being hit over the head with an iron bar. But a closed head injury, where there are no obvious external wounds, no bleeding, but there's still brain damage inside. You've heard from Elizabeth that different parts of the brain can get damaged at different times, because not all the brain is formed at the same time. And you've also heard from her that only about 30% of people with FASD have the characteristic facial features, because the face develops mostly in the first trimester, whereas the brain develops all the way through and continues to develop well into adulthood and beyond. And you've also heard how much of the baby's brain is damaged depends on how much alcohol she or he is exposed to and how sensitive or vulnerable he or she is to that alcohol. And we all know that different people have different sensitivities to alcohol. Now, we're sensible people, I hope. I also hope we're not going to argue that alcohol is not a teratogen. In other words, that it does not cause physical deformities in a developing baby. I hope we're not going to argue that alcohol is not a neurotoxin, that it kills brain cells. So I hope we agree on this bit. What we can call primary disability, the brain damage, the bit that doesn't get better. Now, I'm always more interested in changing the things I can change and not even trying to change the things I can't change, like fog in Wellington. What brain damage can do is to lead people into dysfunctional behaviors, unhelpful patterns, like being disruptive at home and at school, or getting into trouble with the law, amongst other things. I think we can call these secondary disabilities. So what are these secondary disabilities? Well, again, as Elizabeth pointed out, Anne Strysketh from the University of Washington, the Fetal Alcohol Diagnostic Unit, FADU, identified some of these in a good study. These are problems like paying attention and sitting still, and I can see some of you in the audience. Having anxiety or depression, and it's pretty hot under these lights. And making good decisions or having cognitive problems and other problems. And although I'm joking about this, these are serious matters. Having school problems or problems with teachers and other students causes a great deal of difficulty long term, both for the young person and for society. And it's not rocket science. Not being able to keep up with other students, not performing well, being stood down, being excluded from school. Not so long ago, I saw a six-year-old girl who had been excluded from school. Now, obviously, trouble with the law is in red, because that's what I want to talk about. And as you can see, there are other very worrying problems affecting a large proportion of those with FASD, like winding up in a mental health facility or an alcohol and other drug treatment facility, or in prison, having inappropriate sexual behaviors, or having their own alcohol and other drug problems. Now, I think these poor chickens can give us some idea of what's happening. When I first did this presentation to a number of youth court judges, it appeared to me that some of them were about to fall off their chairs as they suddenly realized the enormity of it. Now, some background to these chickens. I don't like animal experiments much, but what they did was they got fertilized chicken eggs. They drilled a hole in the top of them, and in half of them, they squirted in a little bit of alcohol, probably vodka, I didn't know. Now, there are no prizes for guessing which chicken was alcohol exposed. As Elizabeth has said, they're the physical manifestations. If alcohol is present at the time that the face is forming, and the chicken on your left has small eyes, a small head, it's got growth retardation, and you can see funny claws. More importantly, because I work as a psychiatrist, I'm interested in behavior. Both of these chickens were placed in a box. And as you can see, there's a glass window on one side of the box, and there's a door. They turned the light on, and the chicken saw the food. Both chickens ran at the food and hit the glass. the chicken that had not been alcohol exposed wandered around the environment thinking there might be another way out of this. I imagine that. Unfortunately, we can't get this data, you understand. The chicken that was alcohol exposed, if the experimenter was not so kind, would probably still be in there. So what has this got to do with FASD youth offenders? Now, Judge Stephen O'Driscoll said, we've probably all thought about this. In May 2011, in the New Zealand Law Journal, which you can all find, he posed a number of questions. And he posed a number of questions on the exact issues that the chickens present. Why young people do not seem to learn from their previous appearances in court. Why they cannot complete their community work sentences. Why they have little appreciation of the damage they cause themselves, but also the harm that they cause to their victims. And he concluded that fetal alcohol spectrum disorders may be one explanation. So what do we know about the brain effects of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? Well, as you probably know, if we measure IQ, a full-scale IQ is a composite or an aggregate of a number of components. It's about how well we understand words or verbal comprehension. It's about perceptual reasoning, processing speed, working memory. Now, from Elizabeth, and as we know, because the data is incontrovertible in my view, fetal alcohol causes a Swiss cheese type effect in the brain. It's not global. Parts of the brain are spared and parts of the brain are damaged. So what this means is that if you measure IQ, there tends to be a lower IQ, but most are not within the intellectually disabled range, which is usually taken to be a full-scale IQ of 70 or less. Because they score high in some areas, and those numbers compensate. That doesn't mean that their disability is any less. It also doesn't mean that they have any less difficulties with what I call common sense, which I think is quite rare these days. And I'm talking about reasoning, problem solving, impulsivity, and other functions. Because these functions are mediated by the frontal lobes. They're the bits of our brain that sit above our eyes. They're also the bits of the brain that people say differentiate us from other vertebrate mammals. And what some have called the chocolate cake mediator. Now, some of you, as I have, might have come home and have seen a really big, beautiful chocolate cake on the bench, and without thinking, cut ourselves the biggest slice possible and eaten it. And after 2 or 3 mouthfuls, we might have realized and remembered that our significant other had organized a birthday party for a friend to which 50 people were coming. It's very hard to push that piece of chocolate cake back in. Those are what our frontal lobe should be doing, paying attention, thinking about consequences. You guys get it. Because what the studies, and unfortunately we don't have the New Zealand studies. Elizabeth's been talking about PhDs. If anyone here wants a PhD, this is a really good area to get several. But what we know from the studies from North America, mostly Canada and the US, is that these are the kinds of issues that young offenders have. They're opportunistic, impulsive offences. They're easily influenced by peers. They don't plan things that well. They steal mongrel mob cars and then ring the police when the mongrel mob are chasing them. And unfortunately, I'm not joking. It's heartbreaking, some of this stuff. They confess to crimes that they didn't commit. I've been involved in a number of investigations, wasting days of police time with young people that simply did not commit the offence, and they've gone in and confessed. They waive their rights, they don't learn from mistakes, and also they fail to comprehend the impact of the offence both on themselves and on others. They claim innocence even if they've got the chocolate cake smeared over their face. They plead guilty when they may actually be innocent, may not run away from a crime, and may commit broad daylight offences and overreact when touched or apprehended. What we also see is the flip side. Not only are these young people with FASD being perpetrators, and Valerie and I have seen several young people who have committed the most serious of crimes, but they're also, in the majority, victims themselves, easily led, physically and sexually abused, and harming themselves. And gang leaders know this, because they can be easily led. The North American data is clear, and our own anecdotal data, preparing reports for the Youth District High and other courts, most of them are property offences. Shoplifting is the most common. There are also burglaries, property damage. In the US, they call there's a term called vehicular damage, which I included just because I could say that. And then violent offences, as I've alluded to, including sexual offences. Now, the criminal justice system has a number of presumptions. It presumes that offenders have the ability to learn from the consequences of their antisocial behaviour. And it also assumes that before perpetrating a crime, the person thinks, hang on a second, I'm facing 10 to 15, I better, hang on, let me just change weapons so that I'm... The important thing about this is it assumes that they have that ability. But what happens if someone has brain damage that's not always obvious, and they have difficulties understanding cause and effect, understanding the social norms of behaviour, and having problems learning? Now in court, the FASD offender may not be able to sit still or pay good attention. Courtrooms are very stressful places. I find them stressful, and I'm presenting myself as an expert witness, not someone who is going to be led away. They have problems understanding legal terms, usually. And what we've heard is that many young people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder have great difficulty following multi-step instructions and comprehending abstract concepts. They get frustrated, overwhelmed, have problems distinguishing what's real and what isn't, and can get easily led during questioning, which really upsets and annoys police. Initially I found it, I could see a humorous aspect to it, but the more I've worked in this area, I can see it's quite tragic, actually. So as you can see, it creates a plethora of issues, like competency or capacity to stand trial. As I've talked about the issue of false confessions, diminished capacity. It also relates to how well the youth advocates or legal counsel are able to help them, and the risk for future offences. And how does an FASD youth offender fare in a detention facility at whatever stage of proceedings? The answer is not good. They may copy deviant behaviour of others. There's the risk of victimisation, especially in adult facilities. And most have not been previously diagnosed with FASD. Or they may have been misdiagnosed as having ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder, or conduct disorder, or bipolar disorder, or personality disorder. So we've talked about the chickens, we've talked about the chocolate cake, we've talked about the court process. Are there really enough numbers of young people affected in the criminal justice system to have us sit up and pay attention and worry about it? Or is this someone else's problem? In a word, no, it's our problem, because that's where the evidence is clearly pointing. Sheila Conroy and others in British Columbia showed that about a quarter of youth had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. It's about 10 to 40 times higher than the expected prevalence. And this has led to editorials like from the Vancouver province in 2006, that's 6 years ago. I think we have quite a lot of catching up to do. And you can read that for yourselves. I also don't need to remind you about drinking culture in New Zealand and Australia. Even if you were to question that data's applicability to the New Zealand context, there are no proper New Zealand studies done. We have the youth justice provisions of the Children and Young Persons and Their Families Act, 1989. A lot of other jurisdictions that have expressed their admiration for these. Most youth offenders do not wind up in the youth court, that they get diversion. The principal youth court judge, Andrew Beecroft, made a guesstimate of about 100 to 200 young people in the youth court with FASD, using that conservative 1% prevalence from international data. I don't think it's hard to argue that that's actually quite a lot of young people. Now, for those of us working in the area, there seems a lot to do. So we had to figure out where to start. First, we identified that there was a problem. So a group of us headed over to Seattle and Vancouver. We met the international experts, some of the people that I acknowledged right at the beginning. And they reminded us that a multidisciplinary approach, that is not just one person guessing or giving an opinion, is the right way forward. And that it needs at least one trained medical doctor, trained in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder diagnosis, and that's usually a psychiatrist or a pediatrician, and a trained neuropsychologist. And that's basically how Valerie and I have come to work so closely together. We came back to New Zealand, we put a small team together to test our diagnostic abilities, We asked for referrals, and Judge Andrew Beecroft and others mandated the project. This was in no way an epidemiological project. It wasn't representative of the entire New Zealand population. It was there to check whether we could follow the same process and procedures in diagnosing it at a stringent or high level as they were doing in the United States and Canada. We identified, well, we had basically 11 referrals of possible prenatal alcohol exposure, many of those through the youth court, and we evaluated the outcomes and processes thereof. We found that about 8 met, well, not about, we found that 8 met the University of Washington criteria for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and that 3 did not. What you'll also notice, under the 8 are a number of different terms, and in my experience, the medical profession is strange because there's often a lot of infighting about nomenclature and who calls what. So for the purposes of this, we've just lumped it together under fetal alcohol spectrum disorder rather than arguing about the minutiae of the details. We followed these cases through, and overwhelmingly, including from a number of the young people, the mantra was, if only someone had told us about this earlier. But, as with any condition, it had sometimes been missed. We gave advice and information about FASD to the significant others involved, and that included the multi-agency, multidisciplinary nature of it, working with child, youth and family, with education, and often involving the High and Complex Needs Initiative, which some of you will know about. It was getting speech and language therapists involved, occupational therapists, and sometimes treating the comorbid ADHD and anxiety, which was a result of the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. A couple of cases, we advised the court about disposition, saying that this young person was unfit to stand trial, in our view. And both Valerie and I have spent many days answering question after question about whether we were really sure that alcohol could cause brain damage and what was our basis for that. It has been hard but good training to be legally questioned on these matters. In the end, we demonstrated that we could do it here, which was good. But what we also identified that we needed to upskill other people as well. We needed to work within not just the health sector, but other sectors too. And mostly that the New Zealand government was going to be paying for it, and the New Zealand government, which means you and me, because of our taxes, we're paying for it anyway, because it costs about, $50,000 or so to have someone in prison. That's irrespective of the indirect costs, the suffering and the damage. There's also evidence that recidivism can be reduced, and that's what I'm interested in, changing the things we can. And thinking things through like sentencing, disposition, and treatment. Now, none of this is easy, and I'm going a little bit faster because I've got the word from Christine that I need to finish. But in 2010, the Canadian Bar Association recognized FAS and its disabilities, and it made a very strong statement. And it was basically that the normative assumptions that a person acts in a voluntary manner, makes informed choices, but that doesn't always fit with someone with brain damage caused by FASD, and that those principles are simply not valid. and it resolved to support and advocate for access to justice and resources as an alternative to criminalising those with FASD. Lobbying government about policies and advocating an amendment to the sentencing laws. Not to be soft on young people who have done extremely bad things, but also to protect themselves from themselves and to protect us from them. Because if they were to have completed their sentence and been released and simply reoffend and nothing's changed. Now, progress is being made. Judge O'Driscoll has written this in the New Zealand Law Review. You can find it. Echoes a lot of what the Canadian Bar Association says. We brought this to the attention of the judiciary. We get asked to continue to upskill the judiciary in this, to educate legal counsels. What we really need, though, are New Zealand standardised scales, but that comes back to my plea for people to do more PhDs. And for more information, talk to Christine. Thank you.